Hi, my name is Trey Grant, the founder and director of the Specs Movement. First of all, thank you so much for downloading our Specs material. We hope that this material will be beneficial to you, your family, and your community. The reason we produce this material is because we desire to facilitate creative conversations about race for the purpose of promoting racial reconciliation. However, the only way racial reconciliation can happen is through personal reflection, repentance, and redemption. We hope seeing life through someone else's specs will help you experience these 3 R's in your life. Now do me a favor, make sure you subscribe to our Facebook page and our website blog, and help us spread the word about the Specs Movement. In fact, if you would like to learn more about starting a Specs Movement in your community, please go to our website, www.thespecsmovement.com/join-the-movement.
So thanks for coming, Quincy. Quincy and I have had a chance to talk a little bit on the phone, and I already think he's an awesome guy. But if you'll give us insight to kind of some of your story, just so we know where you're coming from.
All right, definitely. Well, my name is Quincy Jones, and I was named after Quincy. I'm sure you were curious about that. I'm from the Washington, D.C. area. I was conceived on the campus of Howard University. My parents were music majors. That's how I got the name Quincy. My father was heavily into jazz. They tried to stay together for about 3 years, and after that didn't see my father until again I was about 14. And then I didn't see him again. I saw him once a year from there, and I saw him again at my high school graduation. My father then died 5 years later of AIDS. And so, but that was my father. My mother was a single mother, raised me mainly by herself with my grandfather. My grandfather unfortunately struggled with alcoholism. By the grace of God, when I was 15, he overcame that. And so, but he was basically my father. But my mother raised me by herself, dropped out of school when she had me, went back to school when I was 8, graduated when I was 10. That was a great example for me as a young man, the importance of education in not only in my life, but also for my advancement as an African American and as an African American male. Let's see. So I grew up in one of the most diverse areas of DC, Silver Spring, Maryland, which I grew up in actually a black community, which was also heavily Hispanic as well as international Africans, Caribbeans. And then I grew up in the 70s, 80s when busing began as well. So they were busing African American students from African American communities to white and affluent communities and into their schools. And so went to schools with Jews, many Jews, a Jewish community, large Jewish community, large white affluent community in Bethesda, Maryland. And so if you look at my school pictures when I was young, it was like the UN. But I grew up in a black community. I also grew up in the black church. My mother was a singer, choir director, and so I spent most of my time growing up in the church, in the black church. So growing up, I had a unique experience of going to church in the heart of DC, in the inner city DC, growing up in a black community, but then being schooled right now we have a very diverse crowd right now. So kind of my schooling looked like this. And so what was interesting was that a lot of my best friends, when I was a child, were white. And so, which also gave me some ridicule when I was little from some of my friends in the church in the inner city. saying, "You sound white," you know. And so that was about the time where I realized, well, you know, being black means being different. Well, another time I realized too that I think I'm answering one of our early questions here, but a time where I began to realize that being black meant you were treated different was when I was in elementary school, second, third grade. Started to like, since it was the UN, like I said, and so the little girls that I liked white girls, black girls, you know. So the little white girls, they didn't like me because I was black, and so I was like, oh, I didn't realize that was a problem, right? Because everybody was my friend, and so that was about the time I began to see that being black was different, and then through just learning history, and then into high school, junior high and high school, is when things really kind of hit the fan, and I can share more about that. Let me just stop there. So that's kind of the beginning of my story.
Yeah, and that does answer. It was about when you realized that it meant anything, really.
Right.
And what are some of the words that maybe you remember from back then or more recently that you hear that people describe you or other black males in particular?
Sure. Well, let me continue with some of my stories. I think that'll help too. So, coming from elementary years and my child years, my mother got sick when I was about 11, 12-ish. And she was diagnosed with lupus scleroderma. Mother was a hard worker. She worked 2-3 jobs. Was going through school at the same time. And she probably worked herself into sickness. But short story, we had to go on welfare. So we had to go live in Section 8 housing. But interestingly enough, the Section 8 housing community that we lived in, we moved further out in the suburbs. Where I lived was on the edge of DC where I grew up until I was about 14. But the Section 8 housing community was further out in the suburbs, which was surrounded by affluence. So right across the street, we had $250,000 homes, you know, affluence right across from us. So it was very interesting. But with that said, basically during that time, we began to go to a white church, an all-white church. And that was actually where I first began to experience implicit bias, racism. The church loved us. I mean, the church was like family. The youth pastor and their family adopted me. Their last name was Jones. My mother was in the hospital a lot, so I stayed with them. But we began to, he took me to a father-son dinner. My father wasn't around. I was about 13 at the time. And he said, "This is my son." As he went and took me inside, and people kind of looking at him funny, like, "Oh, okay, you know, your son, huh?" And so, and then there were other situations where, as I began to bring my friends up from the neighborhood, I realized that the church looked down on my neighborhood. It was right down the street. It looked down on the kids and the folks in the neighborhood, Section 8 housing. There was drugs in the neighborhood and things of that nature. So brought my friends up one time. They were accused of stealing food. There was food left out. We were playing basketball. And I think we just ate it because it was there, you know. But they accused us of stealing, accused them of stealing. My mom, we were talking about it today, and she reminded me that she used to bring kids up for these good news clubs that they had, and they told her, "You need to teach them social skills. These kids don't know social skills, and we need to teach them. Well, we don't have enough room for them, so you can't bring them up." And so that's the moment where I began to realize that. And then some of the words that I would hear is describing me, or describing my friends, or describing folks in my neighborhood, or young African American males as thugs. Other words as lazy. Other words that I can think of that I've heard over the years too is incompetent, no good. I've heard things like, excuse me a second, I want to jump to my notes here that I have written. don't you hate it when your mind goes blank like that? You're talking and you just, I don't want to say it's age, right? Suspicious looking, things of that nature. You know, in my neighborhood where we lived, you know, we would just be hanging outside, 13, 14 years old. There was a lot of drugs in the neighborhood. Eventually got involved with drugs, but even before then, when the police would come through, they would just stop us on the dime. They said, "Oh, you guys look suspicious. You know, what are y'all doing?" We're just hanging out, you know. I mean, we didn't have anything to do but to stand around and, you know, we would be throwing a football, or we'd be, we'd find creative things to do in the neighborhood, but suspicious, thug, lazy, no good, incompetent, inferior. Those are the types of words that I've heard over time, and still at times do. So.
And it sounds like, along with the words, just you feel it too. Like you feel the actions or the non-actions toward you, which probably speaks just as louder than actual words. And how is that? Has it affected you, and how, or have you seen it really affect people close to you? Yeah,
well, it did growing up, and then becoming an adult. One of the things I had to overcome as a young man, and not just from the implicit bias I heard from around me, but also from images in the media and things of that nature, that this is the life that was the life for me as a young black male. Remember, this is 80s, 90s, drug epidemic, crack epidemic hit really hard. Hip hop is growing, but hip hop at that time was very conscious. It was a black consciousness, which is growing again in hip hop. It's kind of resurging, but so hip hop it didn't have the stigma that, at least popularly didn't have the stigma that it does now, but in the beginning. But all that to say is that
just affecting you. Like
the way that it ended up affecting me was that I had to get over this idea that this was all the only life that was for me. I felt trapped. Genuinely trapped. My mother was on welfare. We ended up going on Social Security. For me, I didn't believe that I could, as a poor black man, that I could succeed. And the role models that I had around me weren't many. The ones I had around me were guys being locked up, going to jail, and with no fault of not being able to have opportunity, or not pushing themselves to their potential because they had this sense of hopelessness. It wasn't because, if you talk to any brother on the street, there's no brother that's going to tell you that they don't want to succeed in life. They don't want great things for themselves or for their family. I worked with the FACT program, Tarrant County, the Tarrant Workforce Commission, as well as a number of other community organizations. I was working with New Day Services for Children and Families, and we were working with brothers who were mainly coming out of prison trying to reestablish their lives. And so I did this for almost a year, working with fathers, also dealing with CPS issues and child protective services issues and things of that nature. So all that to say is that whenever you spoke with them, all they wanted for their lives was success. They just wanted good things. And so, so what I had to overcome was this sense of, can I succeed? If I try, will there be opportunity for me? Will even if I do all of these things, if I go to school, go to college, get a degree, will I still be able to have the same opportunity afforded me as a white man? And so, and those were the doubts that I basically really had to overcome, to the point where you end up sometimes beginning to self-sabotage because you don't believe that you can succeed. And so that's something that I've had to work through psychologically. And the other thing is, within my professional career, always having to deal with this issue in my mind of feeling like I have to prove myself as a black man, because you have to, as a black male, you have to be better than, or you have to prove that you're not incompetent, or you weren't an affirmative action hire, or you know, you're not there as a result of tokenism, or you know, that you are competent, you are articulate, you have the skill set, and so that's something that you always, in some sense, is in the back of your mind that you're, dealing with in the professional world as well. Even with a master's degree, bachelor's and a master's degree, you still have to work through those issues. So.
And you've touched on this some already, but the implicit bias, like where do you think it comes from, or where it starts, or how people?
Well, the video, I think, really was masterful in showing the history of where implicit bias comes from for most of us, for our country and our society. But I think immediately, for those who aren't necessarily touched, many of us aren't aware of history. The history of this is how we have seen African American males. But, it's happening in each generation. But to make it very simple, I was thinking about this on the way here, and the reason why we have implicit bias for African American males, why do we afraid of guys wearing a hoodie? It's the same reason why when you get on a plane and you see someone with a head wrap, a female or a male, or anyone who has an Arab with a large beard, you begin to wonder, what's going to happen here. I teach religion at All Saints Episcopal School, and I teach middle schoolers, and so we were talking about Muslims, and so one of the things that I'm teaching them about in 8th grade is world religions. So we were watching a video about different religions' view of God, and in the section on Islam, they were singing the prayer before when they begin their service. And in the beginning, they sing Allah Akbar, which means God is great. And so, but many of my students only, the only thing that they understood or connected Allah Akbar with was when they've seen on the media videos of terrorists before they commit a terrorist act yelling Allah Akbar. They didn't see that in the beautiful expression of the faith. So the only media exposure or images that many of us have of Islam is terrorism. And so whenever you have only those types of images, the only thing you can think of when you see a Muslim is something negative. And it's the same thing as it relates to black males, So if you look historically at the images that we've seen, and mainly in the news, there's so many great stories that we could show in the news about African American males historically. But all you see is this individual who robbed a liquor store, or this individual wanted for murder. Why were these images chosen? So the implicit bias comes from the negative images that are proliferated in the media, and then conditioned by our culture, our families, our friends, our stereotypes, our jokes, those types of things. I hope that's helpful. I know that.
I think
I'm a preacher, so I can be long-winded. So hopefully y'all are charting with me in all of this. So.
I think, like you said, it's one of those things through media, and then it's passed to like our individual families, and it just continues of like that conditioning, which seems like a strong word, but that's kind of, we may not mean it that way, but that's kind of how it happens, where we continue to teach and be taught the same thing, and to kind of fear what we don't understand.
And that's why these conversations are so important. This is so encouraging, even though we may feel like, we wish there were more people here to have this conversation. It starts with individuals, each of us stepping out and getting to know someone outside of our own race, regardless of where we're coming from, because we all have bias. And so the issue I tell my students is, once you humanize, we bring the human element into it, regardless of what the issue is, it changes the way your perspective, the way you see it. And so once you know a Muslim, or once you know an African American male, or once you know, a white male, and you have a friendship, or you have some type of relationship, it changes the whole game in terms of how you see those individuals. And that's something cool.
A little bit about law enforcement. Do you have any experience or thoughts in relation to law enforcement, or how that plays into the implicit bias, and even like with media highlighting that?
Well, that is a loaded question on one hand, but I could just speak from my experience. I'll just say at the present time that I am a personal supporter of law enforcement, of local law enforcement. I know I have friends who are police officers' family as well. However, I have been a personal victim of excessive force and police brutality, as well as harassment by police officers. So growing up, again, back to my story, growing up in the DC area, I got involved with drugs and different things. I mentioned already how police would harass us as they came into the neighborhood. I told my students a story. I said, I want you to, I'm going to tell you a story, and this was my story, but I said, this is a scenario. And I said, there's a guy who had a stolen car. It actually wasn't stolen. It was a car that he got through a borrowed car from a drug deal, like a petty drug deal. So, but the individual, after they finished getting high, called the car and stole it. So, this individual was pulled over, or the police saw them, tried to pull him over, and so they ended up running from the police and leading them in a chase for about a mile. This person jumps out of the car to run from the police, runs into the woods, gets caught up in the woods, trips, police catch him. As the police are running upon him, he says, "Okay, you got me. Basically, I surrender. You got me." And from there, in the woods, no witnesses, the police began to beat this guy up incessantly, kicking, punching in the face, kicking in the ribs, and I asked my students, "What do you think about that?" Half of my class said he should have never ran, shouldn't have resisted. The other half of the class was like, he was giving up. Why did they beat him up? And so basically that was me. That was my story. And so for me, that was excessive force. It was unnecessary. At the time, I had no weapon. I had, I was on the ground face down with my arms up. I did run. But there is unfortunately in the culture, and I'm thinking of people outside looking in as well as, and I don't want to misrepresent law enforcement, but at the same time, there's a culture and a mindset that says that even those who are on the wrong side of the law, if they resist in any way, then they deserve whatever they get. But that is not a just or proper application of the continuum of the use of force that is taught within law enforcement. And so, unfortunately, that kind of scarred me for life in terms of as well as my other experiences. As to my trust level of police officers. And so, especially within recent years and all that's happened, and I think that's a part of the reason why that happens. And then historically, that's happened because, if you look at the history of the relationship of law enforcement and the African American community, it's not a good one. We're working on that now, I believe, in a positive way, but it just hasn't been a good one. And it started from slave patrollers to the Ku Klux Klan, and then being the control of the African American community put into the hands of the police, law enforcement, which we can go back and look at history and see that, I mean, look at Bloody Sunday, you know, and Selma, March and Selma, and different things of that nature, and just, because of those things, the African American community has a distrust of police force, that they're not for us. But that's not necessarily true. And so how do we overcome those? I think these kinds of conversations help in that. So that was my experience with law enforcement. I did have some positive experiences later on where there were those who helped my mother in times where I was in trouble with the law. There was an individual who was connected to law enforcement, who was also a fireman when I got beat up, didn't allow my mother to see my mugshot. He heard about it, told her, but said, "You can't see this because it'll break your heart. You don't want to see this." You know. But he also helped us through that process, and so yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah. You sent me a story about James Waters here in Dallas after the recent officers were killed recently. I mean, the question was, how does it resonate with you, which I think you answered a lot of that, but is there anything else about that story? Or if you want to share some of that story.
Yeah. James Waters was a successful businessman in Dallas, and his wife was an attorney and an ordained minister. One of them, he graduated from Columbia, she graduated from Stanford. And so on the night of the shootings in Dallas, the police shootings in Dallas, where the fallen officers, when the officers were killed, he was afraid to he didn't leave his office that night. And his wife didn't want him to leave, and he only lived 10 minutes from there because he was concerned of what might happen on the way, getting pulled over, getting, basically profiled or by police. And so what basically this article is saying is they did all the right things America said to do, but they still have to be concerned with being black. They have to teach their sons that when they're pulled over, there's a certain way that you have to talk with police officers. There's a certain way you need to make sure you put your hands on the steering wheel. Make sure that they see your hands, that you speak a certain way. Don't rush it. Don't take these things lightly. That you're black, you'll still be profiled, you'll still be discriminated against. People will look at you a certain way. You have to conduct yourself a certain way. And so no matter how successful you are, there's still, no matter what you wear, what degrees you have, at the end of the day, in America, you're still black. And that means that people, and regardless of how colorblind we want to try to be, those implicit biases still remain, unfortunately.
And speaking of your kids, two of five of them are here, between 14 and 25, so we've got some teenagers and young adults, and you've spoken a little about the law enforcement, but beyond that, what other things do you feel like you've had to talk to them about in regards to just their color and what to expect and things with their generation specifically? Whether it's different or the same as what you experienced?
Well, one of the things I think my kids have grown up in our goal was always to be bridge builders. Part of why I'm here tonight. I went into ministry. I've been in ministry as well as public service with the federal government and different things. And so, but in that ministry work, we always put ourselves in context where we could be bridge builders, so in multi-ethnic context or predominantly white context, because we wanted to, again, be agents of reconciliation. Short story. So my kids have grown up oftentimes in either a multi-ethnic context or predominantly white context. So for them, they have not had all the experiences that we have had as related to race. And so we've had to say, listen, you're still black. even though you have a lot of white friends, they respect you, they love you, they may not treat you the way, you know, you hear, what you hear about in the media, you hear us talk about, you know, you're still black, and these are the things that can, these are the way people can discriminate against you, these are the way that people can see you because you're black. And then while you're out, you also still need to be careful, you know, especially for my sons, and especially when they begin to drive, and one who's been driving, and one who's on his way, you know. And I've, you know, the saddest thing that and this is hard for me to say, is, man, I've shed tears for my sons, you know, worried about them, you know, worried about them dying at the hands of violence, you know, whether that's gang violence, whether that's, you know, police violence, you know. There's, you know, I'm just, you know, I worry about that, but I shouldn't have to worry about my sons and law enforcement, you know. I should never have to worry about that, but I do. And so I've had to tell them, look, don't, just because you can talk your way out of it, don't think that, you know, you can't become a victim also. You know, I've talked to the oldest son about that a lot. So.
Thank you, that's good. And lastly, what I have here is, what are, I know this is another loaded question, but what are some ways do you think we can, I'll say, continue in hopes that we're in that direction of moving away from implicit bias and stereotypes, and what are some things, you know, how do we do that in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I think the last video really helps with that. I hope that's a good segue to that. But I think mainly having these kinds of honest conversations, to listen to the perspective of others and validate them. A lot of times, especially, and unfortunately in the churches I've been a part of, in the communities I've been in, when I've said, this is how black people feel, or this is what black people see, the question is, well, I don't see it that way. Or why? That's not, you know, well, that's not true, or, you know, you shouldn't think like that. And I'm like, it is what it is, you know, this is how we see, this is how we feel. And so a lot of times our perspectives aren't validated. They're not, you know, we're seen as, you know, well, that was in the past, why don't you just let that go? Or, you know, well, racism, there's no racism today. And people aren't willing to really hear and listen. And I think that you have to be willing to do that on both sides, and to really have a conversation. I mean, it's only when marriages stay together, right? You know, and so, and you have to be willing to be wrong too, you know, and to be humble in your own perspective, and to, and then to respect the perspective of others.
Yeah, I think what you said is, you know, to me, in my opinion, I think that's the huge key is just relationship and like being in community, and like what y'all have done, being in multi-ethnic community of like getting to know people that look different, that believe different, right? And like really genuinely get to know them, not just out of like some homework that you have to do, but really get to know people and their story, because it puts a name and a face to all the stories and the history that we hear, and And
one last thing, I think, when it comes to politics or issues, because all these things are political, they're issues that we talk about, you know, we have to remember they're not issues. We're talking about people, you know what I mean? And so a lot of times we deal with these things as issues to have a position about whether it's right or wrong. Well, I want to put my feet in the shoes of the people that are experiencing this. And once I do that, I see it from a whole different light. That's why I love what you guys are doing here, you know, with the Specs movement, because we're like, listen, we need to really see life from someone else. We need to have empathy. And once we have empathy, then I think that's a major game changer. And I think that's in every movement that has brought about social change and justice, is because we somehow, the light was shined on it in a way that people began to empathize with the people that were experienced the oppression and the injustice. And then folks were like, we need to change this.